off at number 5, the massacre of Nataruk. And whilst this may not be the most surprising entry on the surface, after all, battlefields and sites of mass brutal warfare are often the first place that archaeologists look when trying to dig up the many ghosts of the past. No, because it's in the sense and scale of the Battle of Nataruk that makes this one incredibly interesting from a modern perspective. In 2012, just off the southwest edges of Lake Turkana in Kenya, a mass pile of bones were uncovered at a site known as Nataruk. To begin with, researchers first discovered several bones in a site that had once been a lagoon that were in the process of gradually being revealed by the sands of time. But as they dug deeper, the crew found a total of 27 skeletons, some that were nearly complete and some that were merely a few fragments of bone. But all of them had one thing in common. They dated back between 9,000 and 10,500 years ago. But it was in the haphazard arrangement of these skeletons that really made the researchers take note, because Nataruk was by no means a burial site, but instead evidence of a brutal massacre. A massacre that occurred with at least 30 people in a time where anthropology believes that humanity only roamed in small groups of hunter-gatherers. Pretty much all of the bodies harboured blunt force trauma head wounds, as well as evidence of arrow wounds to the head and neck. They were men, women and children, and one of them was found with her knees broken, lying on her side with her wrists in front as if they were bound. Although the massacre of Nataruk still only offers more questions than answers, one thing is for certain: war has been a bloody page in our history books for a lot longer than we first thought. Swinging in at number 4, Arnegunde's mummified lung. Which, if you can't tell already with part 1 and part 2, pretty much all of these entries would make up a noteworthy death metal album in their own right, and Arnegunde's mummified lung is no exception. Mainly because I just love saying Arnegunde's mummified lung. Anyway, if you know anything about ancient European history, you will know that the Merovingian dynasty of legend that ruled throughout Central Europe up until the 8th century, predominantly as kings and queens of France and Germany, were pretty interesting folk to say the least. The vast majority of their remains are buried in intricate stone sarcophagi in the Basilica of Saint Denis in Paris, but in 1959, when an archaeologist was digging through the site, he discovered a pretty strange skeleton that wasn't like the rest. Because this one, as you may have guessed, had a single mummified lung, alongside the rest of her skeleton, a single strand of hair, bits of jewellery and several fragments of textiles and leather. This was Arnegunde Regine, a Merovingian queen that lived between 515 and 580 as one of the 6 wives of King Clotaire I. But why did she have a single mummified lung? No one else did, and it wasn't exactly common practice throughout ancient European culture, right? Well, as it turns out, yes, it was, although the Merovingians were just really bad at it. In a few isolated cases, their people would attempt to embalm particularly elite individuals following the mummification procedure that they'd learned from the Romans, which in turn the Romans had adopted from the Egyptians. It's like telephone but with mummification. Their idea was to inject a strange tincture into the throat of the corpse and kind of just hope that it mummified the rest of the body. In this case, nope, it was just a single lung. Nice try though. Next up at number 3, Pit of the Bones. And we've had many pits as so far in our top 5 scary archaeological list, most notably the Pit of Arms that you guys aptly decided to call the Armpit, but this one is a little bit more terrifying than the rest. And what if I told you it contained evidence of death and burial that was at least 500,000 years old? Yeah. Hold on a minute. In Spain, in the Atapuerca mountain range, lie a series of caves that wind deep within the rock, and at the end of one of those winding corridors is a pit that plunges 43 feet into the deep darkness. At the bottom of that pit are thousands upon thousands of tiny bone fragments that researchers have found to make up at least 28 individuals of the species Homo heidelbergensis, as well as a completely other unknown species of humanoid, perhaps believed to be of Denisovan origin. Now, don't get me wrong, this particular entry is more intriguing than anything else, but a pit of complete and utter darkness that has over 30 skeletal corpses at the bottom of it, yeah, whilst being something straight out of a horror movie, it's also, you know, sounds like something that would have been planned, right, by say a community of people. But wait, their bodies are over 400,000 years old. Why would anyone be throwing 30 plus bodies down a pit over 400,000 years ago? I mean, being terrifying aside, the Pit of the Bones is awesome, and we're yet to learn so much more from it. Hopefully. Anyway, swinging in at number 2, Cannibal Neanderthals. Again, another band name. am I right? But if we're talking about caves, we also need to talk about one of the most horrifyingly stark reminders of the desperate dangers that the denizens of our fair planet Earth can be forced to take. It is thought that between 120 and 130,000 years ago, our Neanderthal cousins died out after not being able to adapt to the incredible climate change transitioning across our planet. It is thought to have taken several generations, but in that brief period of time, it seems that Neanderthals were forced to go to incredibly extreme lengths to survive. There are over 220 European sites alone that show similar evidence, but one in particular has perhaps the bleakest encounter. In the cave of Bois-Moulagursi in southeastern France, archaeologists discovered 120 bones from over 6 individuals that would otherwise have gone unnoticed as they were mixed together with a grouping of animal bones. The Neanderthal remains showed a brutal resemblance though, as each of the bones was shown to have desperate cut marks across their entire skeleton, literally from head to toe. Not only that, but they also shown clear signs of crushing and chewing in a manner that was consistent with a single episode of cannibalism. Neanderthals usually buried their dead, but not in this case. Researchers believe that this was the final desperate act of a dying species forced to resort to eating their own people in an attempt to survive. It by no means makes them monsters, but instead people who had no other option if they wanted to keep on living, a species that had failed to adapt to a changing planet. There's a warning somewhere in that one, right? And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the Heslington brain, which makes up 5 for 5 in our death metal album listing because come on, this stuff is just writing itself at the minute. How old do you reckon the oldest preserved human brain is? A couple of hundred years? 500 years? Well, no. The oldest preserved human brain is in fact 3,000 years old. In 2008, buried in a pit near the village of Heslington in Yorkshire, England, an archaeological dig commissioned by the University of York discovered a dismembered human skull buried beneath the earth. Which, you know, any kind of head without a body is already terrifying enough, but of course, in this case, it gets worse. Around the skull were a series of possibly ritualistic objects, but of course there was no body, which instantly begged the question, who the hell was burying heads with ritualistic objects over 3,000 years ago? Well, of course, it gets even more worse because as researchers were making laboratory observations on the skull, they noticed that there was something inside of it, and that was the Heslington brain, the oldest organic ancient brain tissue in recorded knowledge, which had been perfectly preserved in the strange manner that it had been buried. You see, according to researchers, it is thought that the subterranean surroundings of the head did wonders for its preservation, given the fact that it had been separated from the poor victim's body and buried nearly immediately after death. However, as of 2019, the precise mechanism by which the Heslington brain was preserved is a complete and utter mystery. All we have is a 3,000-year-old brain that we have no idea what to do with. If you're asking me, although I usually like to keep a factual head on this shoulders, I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say that this one is probably the likeliest case for vampires. Definitely. Kicking off at number 5, The Pit of Arms, which is a pretty intriguing title, isn't it? If not probably the best opening track to a death metal album. But as it turns out, this particular Pit of Arms is much more terrifying than the likes of Cradle of Filth or Job for a Cowboy, because it's exactly what it says on the tin, or the pit to be specific. Throughout the archaeological dig sites of ancient Europe, researchers have found numerous circular pits constructed in the same strange fashion, dotted across the continent, that all seem to date back to around, roughly speaking, 4000 BC. Most of them have left researchers pretty perplexed, but this one in particular, a pit found near the village of Herxheim in France that was filled to the brim with 6 adult arms, 1 child's arm, and random scattered hand bones. Also, the team of researchers on this mystery obviously had a sense of humour as they named their research paper A Farewell to Arms. So what were they doing there? Well, strangely enough, above the layer of arms and hand bones were the skeletons of the limbless victims, which seems to suggest these Neolithic victims were tortured and dismembered before they were later buried on top. It's left researchers pretty perplexed to say the least, but it seems to indicate evidence of organised warfare in the Neolithic period of ancient Europe, although no other evidence of conflict has been found to support this theory. And people have been digging in Europe for a long time. They could have been captured enemy warriors, or they could have been innocent victims of a massacre. The only thing we can know for certain is their arms were thrown in a pit, and then they shortly followed. That's grim. Coming in at number 4, Hearts of Lead. And yeah, pretty death metal too, right? I could release an album at this rate. In actual fact though, this entry on our list is possibly the most modern that we've ever covered, and yet it still dates back to over 400 years ago. Now, have you ever loved someone so much that you want to be buried with their heart in a lead urn for 400 years? And also, I'm quite concerned as to whether these hearts were given posthumously. I really hope they were. Well, as it seems, archaeologists from France's National Institute were extensively excavating graves for years at an ancient cemetery in northwestern France at the convent of the Jacobins in Rouen, in one of the oldest preserved cemeteries in Europe. There, underneath the basement of the convent, they unearthed hundreds of burials, some of which dated back to the late 16th century, and 5 of which, strangely enough, were buried with the same familiar set of artifacts, a heart-shaped urn made of lead. Oh, that's cute, right? Well, after taking a closer look at these warm fuzzy relics, it was discovered that they each had a human heart sealed within them. After more digging, it became apparent that it was all the rage for wealthy upper class families to be buried with the literal hearts of their spouses and loved ones, and they were also so well preserved that scientists could scan the organs through MRI imaging to figure out what they died from. Nothing says I love you quite like, here's my heart in an urn, right? Coming in next at number 3, the Altamura man. Now, dying alone is a terrifying enough notion, but how about dying alone at the bottom of a 26-foot deep well in the far recesses of a further 200-foot long tunnel system, only to be encrusted into a wall of pure limestone for over 150,000 years? Well, whilst you'd be perfectly preserved and your skeleton frozen in time for modern scientists to find you, that's also exactly what happened to one of our unfortunate Neanderthal ancestors, the Altamura man. And his skeleton was so well preserved that researchers could even recreate perfectly how he would have looked way back when. And he looked like this. What a great looking fella. Hasn't he got the kindest eyes you've ever seen? Well, unfortunately, way back in 1993, when he was discovered by spelunkers in a karstic cave near the Italian town of Altamura, he was a little bit less kindly looking and instead resembled something straight out of a nightmare, petrified by stalagmites and sunken into the cave wall itself through thousands upon thousands of years of limestone droplets. I'm not sure what's more terrifying, the ultimate fate of the Altamura man or the fact that he was discovered when he was lost to the mysteries of the earth for over 150,000 years by a bunch of spelunkers. Next up at number 2, Capacocha. Very little is known about the ancient ritualistic practice of Capacocha, and the earliest known written accounts were from the Spanish conquistadors in their observations of ancient Inca practices, documenting numerous accounts of child sacrifices where children would be led to caves high up in the mountainous peaks of the Andes region to give their lives and be reborn as gods and goddesses in their culture. It sounds like incredibly heavy stuff, and it is, but the practice of Capacocha was incredibly important to the Inca civilization, and it was considered to be the highest honor for members of their society. And although that's terrifying enough in itself, the method in which they were sacrificed is even more terrifying. Essentially, they were paraded around the kingdom with huge feasts held in their honor, where the procession led by the emperor would make its way toward the frozen peaks of the mountain over month-long ritualistic celebrations. There, the sacrifice was taken to a tomb and offered up to the gods, where the tomb was sealed over days with mounds and mounds of dirt. So then, when a group of archaeologists were surveying the region in 1999 at a site found near a volcano in Argentina, they unwittingly unearthed one of these tombs of legend, only to find a scene literally frozen in time. 3 ancient Inca children perfectly preserved in ceremonious fashion down to the ice-cold climate of the region. Whew, yeah, exactly. That's ancient history for you guys. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Sacred Ridge. Now, if you know anything about Sacred Ridge, an ancient site in Durango, Colorado, you'll know that it's synonymous with one of the most grisly and violent atrocities in ancient American history. What was once thought to be evidence of a peaceful habitat of the early Pueblo culture, after closer excavation, it was revealed that Sacred Ridge played witness to a bloody and brutal massacre, given the fact that 2 of the excavated pit houses contain nearly 15,000 human body fragments belonging to around 35 separate people, thought to be about half of the village's population. After analysis of the bone fragments, evidence of extreme torture and mutilation quickly became apparent, and it is thought that the massacre was part of a wider uprising in the Ridge's Basin area sometime around the year 810. Now, the reason for this massacre will never be truly known, but the grisly reality of this discovery can only lead historians to study the archaeological evidence, which all points toward methods of extreme torture. After studying the bone fragments of the the 33 victims' feet, researchers concluded that these methods of torture all bore the hallmarks of hobbling. Yes, hobbling, as in the excruciating action carried out by Annie Wilkes in Stephen King's Misery. It was thought that hobbling was used as a violent warning sign to other victims, but the fact that pretty much all of the bone fragments contain the same trauma marks only leads to more questions. Now, there are a multitude of theories surrounding the fate of the victims of Sacred Ridge, but it seems that the answer, whatever it may be, will be forever lost to the mysteries of time. Kicking off at number 5, the Phaleron Delta necropolis. Now, Greece, of course, is the land of one of this planet's longest standing ancient civilizations, and dig sites are a dime a dozen across both the rural and metropolitan areas of the country, slowly uncovering the mysteries of a long lost Greek society. While in early 2016, researchers discovered one terrifyingly unique manner of burial and mass execution. Apparently because, well, they're not entirely sure. Found in a large ancient cemetery in part of the Phaleron Delta necropolis in Athens were at least 80 skeletons in a line stacked on top of each other with their wrists clamped together in a chain of iron shackles. The strangest thing was, though, that all of these men were incredibly young and in a very good state of health, indicating that they weren't slaves or common criminals, and the orderly, uniform way that they were buried seemed to support this. Whatever happened was an incredibly violent act, with their hands bound above their heads before being uniformly executed. The whole thing doesn't really make any sense at all, but the leading theory is that all of these young men were part of an attempted coup during a period of great unrest for Athenian society. The coup failed, of course, but the fact that these men were all buried in a respectful manner despite the violent circumstances that they were executed in leaves far more perplexing questions than it does answers. Swinging in at number 4, the Persian siege. Now, in the ancient world, sieges and bloody battles were the only real way to get things done, but during an age where the most cutting-edge technology was a composite ballista, it was pretty shocking when archaeologists discovered some startling evidence of chemical warfare. In 256 AD, well, turns out that over 2,000 years ago, 19 Roman soldiers rushed into a cramped underground tunnel as they prepared to defend the Roman-held Syrian city of Dura-Europos from an army of Persian soldiers digging beneath the city's mud brick walls. Instead of meeting a horde of Persian besiegers, though, they were met by one soldier, and then a wall of noxious black smoke turned their lungs into acid. They all died in excruciating pain, sealed for eternity beneath the earth. But flash forward to the 1920s, though, and French archaeologist Robert Dumensil began excavating the Roman site that backed up against the Euphrates River. That's when he found the piled up skeletal remains of the 19 Roman soldiers and one lone Persian at the other end of the tunnel. Initially, he thought that the Persian soldier had somehow managed to defeat 19 highly trained legionnaires in close quarters combat, but that's when he noticed crystals of sulfur and bitumen scattered across the tunnel walls. Turned out the Persian force had developed an experimental tar-like petrochemical that burnt fast and hot and killed with deadly efficiency. Also turns out that chemical warfare was much more common than we expected in the ancient world. What a way to go, eh? Next up at number 3, the mystery of Herxheim. And this one is pretty damn terrifying, really. Sometime in 5300 BC, which is a long time ago, what is known as a linear pottery culture developed in the southwest region of Herxheim in Germany, one that for all intents and purposes could be described as an idyllic, peaceful Stone Age settlement. Safe from invaders and predators, the village thrived with its rudimentary agriculture and societal development. That is until sometime around 4950 BC, when the settlement in Herxheim abruptly and without warning disappeared. But they didn't exactly disappear, instead they were ritualistically butchered, smashed to pieces and buried beneath the same dirt that they once called home. Turns out in 2009 an archaeological dig site unearthed human remains of over 1,000 ancient villagers. The bones were of men, women, children, even infants and fetuses. Stranger still though, tool markings on all of the bones showed that the flesh had been carefully scraped off, while larger bones had been broken, possibly to get at the marrow inside. Hell, even the skulls were cracked open in an effort to extract their brains. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and were incredibly proficient at butchering the human anatomy, presumably to eat, as there was no sign of the removed flesh in the surrounding area. It gets weirder though, because after extracting DNA from their remains, it turned out that these people came from all over Europe in roughly a 500-mile radius. In fact, the leading theory is that all of these people volunteered to come to Herxheim on their own free will to be ritualistically sacrificed processed, and then seemingly eaten. Yeah. Coming in at number 2, the Tomb of the Sunken Skulls. Talking of ritualistic burial sites, there's an even older one, and it's even weirder, actually. Sometime in 2009, archaeologists found what they believe to be a Stone Age settlement near what was once a shallow lake in Motala, a town in southwest Sweden. The routine dig took a strange turn though when researchers discovered the skulls and skull fragments from 11 individuals, including men, women, children and infants. In fact, the site, which would later be known as Canal Jordan, turned out to be nearly 8,000 years old. But we also have to remember that Canal Jordan was a lake, and the remains were found stacked inside a large stone mass grave with a giant heavy lid built on the bottom of a body of water. Hey, it gets weirder though, guys, because 2 of the human skulls found were pierced with wooden stakes, with the majority of the others showing signs of also being penetrated by sharp objects. It seemed to point toward using their heads as some sort of bizarre trophy or totem, but also it poses the question, why would you then bury them underneath a lake in a stone tomb with children? But hey, again, it gets even weirder because one of the female skulls found there was actually filled with fragments of bone from all of the other skulls in the tomb, like some weird kind of horrifying potpourri. The leading theory is that Canal Jordan likely served as a sacred meeting spot for several nomadic bands of Mesolithic Swedes roaming the forest and shores of Sweden over 8,000 years ago. For some reason though, they felt compelled to bury people's heads in a stone tomb at the bottom of a lake, and no one really knows why. My best guess though, vampires. Or aliens. Alien vampires. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the Cladh Hallan mummies. If you know anything about bog bodies, you'll know that they're already terrifying enough. The British Isles are relatively unique in the sense that they're littered with geographical peat bogs, a unique high acid, low oxygen environment which inhibits specific bacteria that break down organics. Because of that, they're also perfect for preserving bodies, and history has shown numerous instances of discovering ancient bodies hidden away in the deep peat bogs of Scotland, Ireland, England and Wales. Well, usually they're just incredibly well preserved, mummified perfectly for archaeological purposes, but back in early 2012, scientists discovered 2 3,000-year-old Scottish bog bodies, remnants of the 11th century ancestral houses of Cladh Hallan, a prehistoric village on the Isle of South Uist. But hold on, because if that timeline isn't already peculiar enough, it gets weirder. Because first and foremost, researchers discovered that these 2 corpses had been buried between 300 and 600 years after their death. Hold on though, because it does get weirder, because these corpses quickly had scientists scratching their heads because their bones just didn't match up, although they showed clear signs of being articulated as one whole cadaver. Turned out after DNA testing each of their limbs, they were from completely separate people, all of which had died at different points in ancient history. It's what's called a composite mummy, and no one has any idea what the hell it was or still is, but for some reason an ancient society was collecting body parts and sticking them all together in some horrifying Frankensteinian manner. Yeah, let that one sink in, just like a peat bog body.